This week we return to the worlds of Rapture and Columbia, this time on Switch. Bioshock, the collection gets a full treatment for Nintendo's handheld, as handled by developers Virtuous and Blind Squirrel. All three are well-constructed ports, if we cut to the chase there, but having already covered the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X versions, it's curious to see how Switch's mobile Tegra X1 chipset holds up in visual comparisons. And of course, whether it can deliver a solid 30 FPS frame rate, where X and Pro targeted a full 60 FPS. So to help answer this and more, I'm joined today by Alex Battaglia. How's it going?
Hi there, Tom. Yeah, like you said, I covered it on X1X and PS4 Pro, where it was pretty good, minus that whole stuttering issue and the anisotropic filtering, so I'm curious to see how Switch pans out in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because there's so much to cover in one go, but we're going to give it our best shot. And to do that, let's go through each one in turn. Bioshock 1 is first. Now, when this released in 2007, this was really a remarkable game, you know, and it really stood out for those amazing water shaders and physics. There's a lot going on at the time.
Yeah, so like regarding physics, like one of the cool things about, well, not the cool things, one of the bad things about the original version of the game before it was remastered was that the game was targeting 30 FPS and all the physics were actually tied to 30 FPS. So any single time like a character ragdolled or anything like that in the original version on PC, even at 60 FPS, it would still be running at 30, so it looked really awkward. One of the great things about the remastering effort, along with a mod that came out on PC, was making those physics actually run at an arbitrary frame rate. Because otherwise, obviously, the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro versions would, you know, not look too great. But in comparison, obviously, on Switch here, we're dealing with 30 FPS, so you're not going to really notice anything, you know, like that at all. But, you know, there's a lot about that original version beyond the physics, which is interesting. It was pretty heavy on, like, GPU bandwidth, so every single time, like, you'd get, like, splashes on the screen or, like, the electroshock effect, it'd be pretty heavy. And I think, like, the Xbox 360, with its EDRAM setup, could handle these really high-resolution alpha effects close to the screen really well. Obviously, though, at its lower resolution. How does Switch hold up there, then, in terms of resolution?
Obviously, Switch has got a lot more RAM bandwidth to play with, and that, as always, translates, you know, last-gen ports coming to Switch. We tend to see similar general settings, but the resolution gets a bump, and in this case, we get it bumped to a dynamic 1080p while docked. Though I've noticed the first two Bioshocks tend to hold up a little better in terms of the scale, so you'll get about 972p during intensive firefights, whereas Bioshock Infinite, which is a more inherently taxing game, tends to drop to around 810p during those busy firefights. It certainly holds the upper bounds I've found, like around 1920 by 1080. It's typically higher on that scale, but it gives it some, you know, headroom, certainly in terms of, as you say, those GPU intensive effects, which really was a center point of the gameplay because, you know, a lot of the plasmids kind of interact with the environment. So you've got like water, which would take in the electricity and work as a kind of gameplay dynamic, and also you've got oil slicks on the floor, which could be set alight. So there's a lot of interplay between the plasmids and the environment, and that means these effects kind of lingered on screen for a while, and if you obviously get a full face of them, that would really hamper the performance side of things on the original consoles at least.
Yeah, so did they end up changing the resolution of those alpha effects, those transparent textures for flames and like sparks and water splashes?
So yeah, I'm glad you raised that actually, because the resolution is great, you know, they've bumped it to 1080p dynamic, but on the other hand, the effects are obviously sub full HD for sure. They're a marked cut down in overall clarity, which means if you get a effect overlapping geometry, you can see these obvious very sharp stair steps which aren't in line with the density of the typical image.
This is something that I also saw on the Xbox One X version of Bioshock Infinite, where they upgraded that version of the game from the original Xbox One with low resolution alpha effects, but for Xbox One X they didn't upgrade the resolution of those effects, so the game was 1440p, but any single time there was transparency effects on the screen and they intersected with geometry, it would look lower res than it actually was. So, I mean, it makes sense, I think, for Switch to do that because it does have, for a handheld, a good amount of memory bandwidth, but it's still constrained in comparison to, say, like how good its GPU compute is.
I'd also say, in Bioshock's defense, it is quite a dark game. And I think as a result of that, the point of resolution doesn't really matter as much. It's kind of like how you pointed out in your X versus Pro comparison. The overall image is more impacted by stuff like anisotropic filtering, which is quite low quality. And, it's a shame on X and Pro they couldn't really get that up to like 8 times or 16 times.
I would imagine it's the same kind of on Switch there with anisotropic filtering.
Yeah, it's pretty low quality. It gives you that, very telltale, soupy, muddy quality. It doesn't really look that great.
Which is a shame because, looking at the footage you sent me, Tom, it looks like the Switch is obviously using the upgraded assets that were remade for the remaster with like the new textures, the new lighting setup where I think they upgrade the resolution of like the baked lighting in the game, among other things. But at the same time, so they have this low anisotropic filtering, so it turns kind of soupy rather close to the camera, especially in comparison to like the Xbox 360 back compat version, which has like 16 times AF applied to it. But they also looks like they kind of reduced texture quality below the Xbox One X version of the game and therefore below the PS4 Pro version.
Yeah, it does. That on-rail sequence at the start really shows off a lot. Texture quality isn't quite as high as X, but at the same time it still looks fine. And with that said, they've done a bunch of other things. They've improved the field of view setting hugely. In fact, I remember playing the original and getting a bit of a headache from just playing it for too long. It was very, very restrictive. You do actually get a toggle to alternate between I think the old field of view setting and the new, but yeah, always keep it to the new. There's an extra bonus as well. You'll notice in this on-rail sequence there's more foliage compared to the 360 version. Obviously not something they can really automatically bump up using back compat on X. Whereas X and Switch are kind of comparable in that sense. You get these long plants stretching up to the seabed.
So with this dynamic resolution setup and also with like reduced alpha effects and reduced AF and like reduced textures, does it at least manage to hold that 30 FPS really well in the first game, or what does the performance look like there?
Yeah, performance wise, I did a good 3-hour chunk of capture and then just ran the whole lot through our tools. There's not I mean, it's like it took a while to filter through, but there's really not much to report on in terms of drops, which is great news for everybody. And I think it was really a worrying sign looking at your analysis, seeing obvious drops under 60 FPS, because I thought maybe there would be this chance there'd be drops under 30 in this one as a kind of result, but it's actually really tightly optimized. You might have noticed already there's frame pacing, hiccups and blips along the road, but I think on balance they're not as pervasive as I've seen in other games. In fact, you're going to get judder as a result of that, no question. But it's fleeting, it's not common enough to bother me, and I think I enjoyed it despite that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing looking at what you sent me. It looks almost like every single time there is a drop for some whatever reason, and it's obviously very fleeting and short, like when you initially go out of the water in the staging area right after the plane crashes, like when there's like this spurt of like mist in front of the screen. It dips for a second there, like much like it does on Xbox One X actually, but then immediately afterward there's two or three upticks to the 16.6 ms line in the frame time graph, which is very interesting because that's basically a weird problem of frame pacing that we don't see too often. We sometimes see it where like the game is actually at a nominal 30 FPS or something like that, but it's actually having frame pacing issues the entire time. I think the great example, of course, is everyone's favorite Bloodborne on PS4. But this one has it where every single time it drops, then it also has upticks afterwards. So there's still actually a drop in real frame rate, but then afterwards, as it recovers to a real 30, that's where frame pacing issues happen, which is weird. I don't think we've seen that too often. It technically makes it look slightly worse than it would for that one brief second, but considering how brief these drops actually are, it's not a real big deal.
No. And likewise for portable play, we should mention that the resolution, while portable, is 720p dynamic. Again, that is really nicely tailored to what the GPU can do. So I'm really happy with how this has turned out. The first game is solid, well optimized, you get better foliage, and much of the game seems to resolve to the upper bounds of that 1080p dynamic res.
Going on to then, I would say Bioshock 2. Is the resolution set up there the same?
Yep, absolutely the same. It's dynamic 1080p and dynamic 720p while portable. Obviously, the game released about 3 years after the original, but fundamentally the engine is quite similar and the gameplay setup is very similar too.
Yeah, it's very much the same. The only thing I noticed on Xbox One X and PS4 Pro was, but they were targeting 60 FPS obviously, and I think we're much more resolution constrained than Switch was when you would use the melee from the Big Daddy, like it would cause frame drops, but I'm presuming that's probably not going to be there on Switch considering it's a 30 FPS and, dynamic res.
Yeah, that drill attack is there from pretty much the start. And also the telekinesis powers where you can just throw combustible tanks. So it's a really good stress test right off the bat, and that's why I can say with more confidence that actually this is going to hold up pretty well at 30. One thing about this, which I found very odd, was the intro sequence as you hold the hand of the little sister and you look in your reflection. Everything there is actually pre-rendered. You can see macro blocking, and the bizarre thing is the frame rate is sub 30 FPS a lot of the way through this because they encoded a take of this scene which was actually just dropping, so you're getting unavoidable frame rate drops there.
So Bioshock Infinite, though, this one came out much later on, obviously, than Bioshock 1, was using an upgraded engine, very much so a heavy PC game at the time, and so when they brought it back into the remastering effort, above the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions of the game, they added a lot of the PC settings, like the ambient occlusion, higher resolution shadows, a lot higher resolution effects as well. How does this translate then across to Switch when you did the comparison to Xbox One X and Switch?
It seems like it's, again, dynamic 1080p and dynamic 720p on the portable side, but it is lacking solid anisotropic filtering.
Much like the PS4 Pro then.
Yeah.
Which makes everything look into the distance rather... PS4 Pro, it really shouldn't be that way in my opinion, but I guess it makes more sense on the Switch, which is pushing this, I would say, late generation game much further,
But yeah, in terms of comparisons, there's quite a few differences.
So one of them, I think when you sent me a screenshot of it, was basically alongside anisotropic filtering into the distance being lower than you would find on Xbox One X, for example. There was also the LOD distance for things like grass, which is actually pretty rare in Bioshock Infinite. And I would say the normal geometry, like the sides of buildings or any of the bushes and plants in the game, were of a lower res or of a lower LOD value the further into the distance. So things would, as you would walk closer, they would kind of morph and snap right in front of your eyes, like these lower LODs to higher LODs. And so things look in the distance a little bit not as good as you could find on something like Xbox One X or PS4 Pro.
There's also stuff like the obvious concessions you'd make, lower res reflections,
Yes.
which is used quite heavily in that beautiful opening sequence where you merge to Columbia, and it's just a gorgeous sequence where everything's peaceful and sort of a utopian, and you just know the other foot is going to land at any point, and then it surely does.
But does the game's performance hold up while making these concessions, to shadow resolution, to game LODs, to anisotropic filtering? Does it at least hold up in terms of performance?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much on par with the original two Bioshock games, and that is a surprise. I mean, we've got to give this its own space, I think, in terms of assessing how the frame rate goes, because by design it's so different. They don't need they've got this open expansive area where you can use kind of a rail system between areas later on anyway, and there's more complex enemy AI, and the whole setup is very different. It's brighter as well, so you can see all the shortfalls and potentially the resolution drops as it goes. But again, it leans on that dynamic resolution setup to just hold at 30 FPS pretty much perpetually. It's hard to really fault it. Again, the frame pacing side of things kind of rears its head all the way through, but it's never as glaring as most Switch titles. And I think this was my biggest worry with Infinite, 'cause I thought this was one of the late last gen titles. It really pushed the system, and as you say, it really pushed PC, and yet on Switch it seems to be getting away with it. Honestly, I think the turnout I'm really impressed by the collection. There's been a lot of ports to Switch so far this generation, of varying quality. This definitely goes down as one of the better ports, and if you're looking to revisit 3 genuine classics of last gen, this is a pretty great way to play it. Obviously there's a preference for PC, and in failing that, X and Pro with their sub 60 FPS drops, but if you're satisfied with a 30 FPS experience, taking it portably, I'd really recommend this one. It's a really well served port. But I think that's all we've got for today. Thanks so much for joining me, Alex.
Of course, Tom, it was a pleasure.
And if you did enjoy this, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get into direct contact with Alex or myself, just use Twitter. But from the both of us, see you next time.